process and giving a few broad injunctions. So I've noted that for us at least, the modeling process is typically conducted with an interdisciplinary team, and it's an ongoing process of refinement. It's not that a model is delivered and it just is used from then on. It's an ongoing point of learning and a nexus of learning. What is ideal, although not always realizable, if you can iterate the modeling, data collection, and intervention implementation. So you're collecting the data the model suggests may be most valuable through sensitivity analyses, and you're putting in place interventions. As I noted earlier, often it's the modeling process that gives tremendous value. Now, broadly speaking, these are the stages of it, bearing in mind it goes in an iterative fashion. So early on in the process, there's often a model conceptualization, sort of thinking, what does this model need to capture? What are we after here? How do we sort of frame the problem? And thinking what needs to be in it and what needs to be out of it. And even more specifically than that, or those three categories I described yesterday. What things are endogenous? The model actually calculates them. It actually produces them. And we compare it, what it thinks will happen against real-world data, for example. Things that are exogenous, they're pre-specified. We put them into the model, put them into there, perhaps into a parameter value, perhaps as a time series. They're pre-specified. And finally, things that are consciously left out of the model for now. These are fluid boundaries that end up evolving over the course of time, but it's very important to get that clarity on sort of what's going to be in this model and to the degree it's in there, is it generated or is it told to the model? There's often a mapping process which involves sketching out that model. See, we could sketch out, for example, causal loop diagrams. We could sketch out these sort of diagrams for our system before actually creating the model that depends on them. We could say, okay, we'll kind of represent people into three care-seeking categories: those that are not seeking care but are open to it, those who are seeking care, and those who are not seeking care but not open to it. You can imagine several categories for vaccination, attitude, etc. We could sketch that out. In a system dynamics context, this type of work is typically undertaken with that construct we call the causal loop diagram. Remember that with gestational diabetes and type 2 diabetes with those loops? That's often undertaken at this stage using that construct. And it's great. You have the team, they sort of come together, and often you can build a fairly articulated sort of maps of the connections. But then at some point, if you want a quantitative model, you're going to need to sit down and formulate the structure of that model. Now, as a technical exercise, for those who are trained in it, this process often itself doesn't, the actual sketching out of the model, the basics of model structure, requires limited time. What takes a lot more time is what values to put in for the parameters. What are the relationships that trigger someone to go from this state to this other state, or that govern the number of people being discharged? That reflects a lot of domain understanding that requires discussion. So this model formulation is really where the rubber meets the road and making the model fully runnable. And that means putting in all the assumptions, putting in some value for it. Now, I want to make a point that's a point of some contention. And it's too bad Jeff isn't here, but he's off likely with one of the groups guiding them. This is a point of a little bit of contentiousness. So the question here is, okay, if we have a data item where we lack good data, what to do about it? And we had a long discussion this morning that related to this issue. What do we do if there's too little data? There are folks who have different philosophies with respect to this. Some say, well, assume a representative value that seems likely to be right. Others might emphasize the calibration side of it. But one thing that often that a a group of modelers is quite leery about is just leaving it out altogether. Because often that's assuming it as the single value, 0, that you know it does not have. You're just leaving out any influence by it. And you know it has some influence, you're just not sure how much. So you got to be a little bit cautious about sort of how you treat that issue of model formulation. I don't have time to revisit that from this morning. Just be aware it's a part of the narrative I didn't have time to hit on. But when model formulation finishes, often the model has uncertainties in it that we work to address with calibration. We work to sort of match up that model against data from the world that can't be used to put in a particular value for any one parameter, but rather helps clue us into what plausible values are for the parameter. We look to the model to reproduce these patterns from the world, maybe dozens of those patterns simultaneously, such as in much of our work. You'll also be engaged in a model testing process that we alluded to this morning as well, with cross-validation, testing the model against data we didn't tell it about when we build it, data that's held in reserve, and we'll test the model to see to what degree it reproduces those patterns that weren't presupposed in building it. We'll undertake sensitivity analysis, but robustness tests in the form of extreme value checking, unit checking. It's a variety of types of checking we can do on the model to develop confidence that it's actually capturing features of the situation, that we built the right model in addition to building the model right. And having built confidence in the model, there's a stage of policy evaluation, which is what Yuen described starting on now. She's using the model to investigate particular scenarios, hypothetical external conditions, to compare the outcomes of different interventions. That's what you saw over lunch. And finally, there's often components associated with knowledge translation, bringing this model to diverse stakeholders, okay, to many parties so that they can appreciate some of the results. You saw some of that today as well in her lecture. Now, a key component of all of this, almost a prerequisite, is building up a model step by step by step in an incremental fashion. Again, I would urge you in the strongest terms, don't just plan to have a model a year from now that'll be great, but rather you've sacrificed in so doing the opportunity to learn along the way. So you might think a year from now we're going to have this model, it's going to be great. It's going to be a, Pasquale Hospital in Regina. It's going to have all these features in it. It's going to capture, this element of the dynamics and the changing schedule of clinicians. It's going to capture people who leave without being seen. It's going to capture patients with multiple comorbid conditions and mental health challenges. And it's going to capture the ALC situation. We're going to have that a year from now. Sounds great. Wow. The problem is you start working on it, and as I said earlier, you might find that it takes you 3 years instead of 1, and you don't have anything along the way. Oh, 3 years ago, we're going to have a great model. Great. Oh, it's going to be terrific. But, at some point, it stops being so exciting to people. And they say, when is that model getting due? When is it going to be built? You don't have something in hand. You haven't gotten value from it yet, except, from the modeling process, but not from the model yet. From the modeling process yet, but the model may still be far off. And that can be dispiriting. But maybe more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, you sacrifice the ability to learn from the model through that process. So maybe a year from now, you're going to have a great model. But the model you have a year from now, if you build it incrementally, will be different than what you would have built a priori. Why? Because by experimenting with it along the way, you'll discover, wow, it is sensitive to this thing, or this data doesn't add up to what we see. Or, this particular issue is a point of contention between how different people believe this part of the system works. So we've got to go and invest before creating that model from scratch based on one person's word. We have to go talk with the different parties about how it really works in the hospital, this area of the hospital. So in short, you end up learning along the way by building the model incrementally in a way that you get a much more rich, satisfying model, and all along the way, you've got something. The model UN is building it piece by piece by piece. She started with the ED, went to the acute wards, went to the community care options, and all along the way, there's interesting things coming up. She's doing checks, etc., and getting some insights. And all along the way, she can show it to people, and they'll say, "Oh, yeah, that makes sense," or "Oh, that doesn't jive with my understanding. Let's go revisit that. I'll go get some data for you that will fill in this gap." Those are very important assets to have along the way. So if I could convey one thing to you about the modeling process, is do it step by step. Don't make the bigger, better model. Down the road, long time, your goal. Build it up modest piece by modest piece and learn along the way and have something to show someone. Often it's not till they see the model that they really get what you're doing. Often it's not till they see the model results that they say, "Oh yeah, I do know something about that." And that model is capturing it, or that model is not capturing it. It's a real, often that's that tacit knowledge that they wouldn't have brought to bear otherwise that's brought out. I've seen that in some very strong terms. Once I showed the model, a clinician suddenly says, "Oh, I never mentioned it, but this model, this certain fact, but this model is actually capturing it." Great. Okay, builds confidence. Or, that doesn't align. We never see those fluctuations, in the surgical ward with such fluctuations in the number of patients. So incrementally building a model all along the way is really important. So you build and you iterate. You build, you make some investment in model formulation, calibrate that changed model, test it out, experiment with it, go back. It helps inform you with sensitivity analysis, what might be next to add to the model. You're going through this iterative process. And sometimes you do a bit of questioning here. You shift something that was exogenous, cold to the model, to become endogenous. Maybe social aspects of social support, aspects of patient choice, or what have you. Lots of benefits from this. I've emphasized some of them. There's actually lots of other benefits too. Much easier to debug a model, to find a problem. If you've just changed one thing, one or two things, and the model's having problems, it's easy to know where to look for those changes. If you're building the bigger, better model a year from now or 2 years from now, and you get to that model, wow, it's great, you're going to run it, and weird things happen. Where did those weird things come from? Maybe they're bugs, and there's a lot of places to look for bugs. Or maybe they're really interesting dynamic behavior, but you don't know what gave rise to that dynamic behavior. You haven't learned the unique contribution of each thing along the way. If you build it incrementally, you add a small thing to it, you see how it changes the model behavior, you're learning what's sort of shaping that behavior all along the way. So incremental delivery, it has many good things to it. And I would encourage you to, if you're going to think about building a model, do so in this step-by-step fashion. Any questions on that issue? It's a very important issue, and one that's central to how folks like Dylan work even outside the modeling area. Questions? Okay. Nothing right now. Okay. I have a whole lecture here on this, but I think I will probably stop here and in terms of this particular purpose. Just be aware that there are frameworks, in fact several of them, for how to specify a model, how to sort of systematically list the characteristics of the model for publishing or for sharing with others. And some of these can inform the the design, how the model is built up over time, and things to keep in mind for that. And there's a good book by Railsbeck and Grimm, which is on the reference list that is part of your binders, which where I've referred to some of these items. Okay, so those are some comments on the modeling process. Any questions on the process as a whole, or what we just talked about with communities? Yes. 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 That's right. That's right. Yeah. That's exactly right. Okay. So why isn't it this? So that's exactly right. Um, and it's really one of the key components to it is sort of, okay, what are you trying to get out of the model? So sort of the classic anti-pattern, the thing you don't want to see here is a situation where someone says, I'm modeling some system. I'm going to model the Saskatchewan healthcare system. Okay, well, what about it? What's your problem? The only perfect model of the Saskatchewan healthcare system is the Saskatchewan healthcare system. Just like the only perfect model of a city is the city. Instead, you want your understanding of what you're trying to get out to be much more specific than that. So you're trying to understand what about the Saskatchewan healthcare system. I'm trying to understand, variability in quality between urban and rural areas. Or I'm trying to understand surgical wait times with respect to the Saskatchewan medical system. I'm trying to understand the impact of private MRI clinics on time to get seen in an MRI within Saskatchewan. You want to be more focused about what particular things are you trying to get out of it, and that's going to shape what goes in and what goes out of the model. Because without that, you use that as kind of, as my colleague Doug Sturman says, you use it as a logical knife to cut away unnecessary complexity. If you just say, I'm going to model the Saskatchewan healthcare system, okay, so what do I need in it, what I don't need? Well, it's almost an invitation to throw everything into it. We're going to put in every nurse's assistant. We're going to put in every aspect of personal care homes. We're going to put in all sorts of details related to people's health status, because any of it could be relevant, from minor allergies to issues having to do with myocardial infarction and issues having to do with mental health. It's not a recipe for scoping a model well. But if you start with a specific question, you don't automatically know everything that's relevant, but you can carve out pieces of it, and you start small, and you say, okay, what are the things that clearly we're going to have no face plausibility unless we bring them to the table? Clearly, they're going to be highly, highly relevant. And you carve out a small piece. And then those other pieces, you may incorporate them later, but right now you may put them aside and you'll try to focus on the most central piece. So this is what you ended with her model. She started with, ED weights project, right? ED weights and patient flow. She started with aspects of the operation of the emergency department and then the wards. And then you work out to the community care options. And then you elaborate some of those community care options and deal with aspects involving home care or what have you. She's successively elaborating this in a way that is germane to what she's trying to figure out, how to lower the wait times. But using that scope, she's been able to exclude a lot of things that would otherwise get in the way. So that delineation of what I'm trying to get out, what is the problem, or what's the research question if it's a research project, what do I need to know? Sometimes I ask a stakeholder, what would a successful project be? Like, what would it deliver you? What particular gain would you get from it? What are you going to be using this model for? Is it to compare the effects of, outbreak response immunization campaigns? How much do we gain from that? Is it to estimate the added burden of costs associated with expansion of hemodialysis capacity? If you can give me a question, I can carve away a lot of unnecessary detail and focus in on the scope of the model that's most relevant. Now, truth in advertising, though, we have to represent that if we do that, we will often have a model that can answer additional questions. It's not merely we have a model that can only be used for that question, that's it. Sometimes we end up with a model can be used to answer sub-questions or related issues, but it won't be suitable for any question. It'll be a distortion for me to say it'll only be for that question, and if your question changes, you'll have to throw it away. No, you won't, but you will have secured a lot of economies, and you'll get that model a lot faster by being very clear about what you're trying to get out of it. And it might be three things. You want to know this, this, and this. You want to be able to assess, how much money are we saving by undertaking outbreak response immunization rather than performing it through traditional immunization channels alone. We want to know so what the cost impact is. We want to know something about to assess the probability an outbreak will occur within the next month based on the recorded vaccination rates. Those might be two questions we bring to bear. And again, that will scope things. Is that helpful? Comments? So it's really what are you trying to get out of it? And then we sort of link back from that, okay, what do we need to represent because of that? Like what things do we need in this model? Yeah? Okay, other questions? Yeah.
Well, more comment.
Yeah.
I think one needs to understand every system is designed exactly to deliver the result you see. So from using that in reverse way to understand why we are at the point we are at is trying to rebuild the system as it is. And then say, okay, this is the problem I want to address. What parts of the current system are the ones that are standing in the way? And that's where you focus on.
Right.
But I think it's important to understand that what you see is not an accidental occurrence.
That's true. Yeah, that's an interesting perspective on it. That's food for thought. Another component that Joachim's comments reminded me of, often in a situation, I'm not sure if I have slides I could show on this, is, often if I'm thinking about some outcome, I'm going to be thinking about, okay, what do I need to address that outcome in the model? So maybe you're interested in a certain intervention. What will be the trade-off associated with, the trade-off associated with improving our, putting in place senior daycare throughout the province, or enhancing the quality of home care. In order to simulate the response, I'm going to need to think about a variety of factors I need in the model. I'm going to need to characterize, how that intervention, senior home care, affects people. So there's going to be certain aspects, certainly, of representing the home, the home care context I'm going to need. But I'm also going to probably need to understand things that this impacts, such as I'm interested in, the ED presentation and in acute care implications of keeping someone properly cared for in their home or not. And I'm going to need to know something about how they flow through the system from home care to things like LTCs, long-term care facilities. So to capture the impact of this intervention on cost and health, there's certain scope with the model that's plausibly going to be required. Otherwise, I'm leaving out the 800-pound gorilla. I'm leaving out where the main impacts will be felt. And then there's sometimes sort of things that are implied by this. Okay, you need to represent, this sort of aspect of it or this sort of aspect just to capture the dynamics here. So in short, when you specify to me, I want to know this, I start to think about the logical sort of tendrils that fills out. Okay, I need this, I need that. I need to represent this sort of consideration. And sometimes those really start to sort of give me a big clue as to what needs to be in the model. But even there, as we've said, it's worth starting at an aggregate level, like sketching out a high-level system dynamics model where you have the different categories very often, so you can start to think about the issue with a concrete model and then work towards greater specificity, greater levels of detail where it's proving sensitive or where you need to to represent that detail to capture the effects of your intervention. You know, if you were to represent in your model the set of people by age in Saskatchewan, that's great, but you need to represent what, you know, people by successive levels of age, particularly elders, what fraction of them, you know, what component of them are in their homes, right? And versus in long-term care or personal care homes or other community care options. And so that implies a kind of requisite level of detail to kind of simulate how the intervention affects things. And that has implications for the scope of the model. So this research question is arguably, it's one of the key things you do to make a modeling project a success is have a defined understanding in mind about what you're trying to investigate. Those helpful comments? Yeah. Okay, other questions? One thing that Jeff and I are thinking of, Jeff is spending an uncomfortably long set of time in the air between here and Australia. It's a long trip, and it's an especially long trip if you have bronchitis on the way, and I'm just so grateful for Jeff's travels here. One of the things that he and I have proposed is actually doing a modeling boot camp focused in substantial part on this issue, conceptualizing the model. Because I actually think it's the hardest piece to teach in the boot camp context just in passing. And I think it's one of the greatest recipes for success of a modeling process. Would you share that view, Jeff?
Yes, I would.
Would you like to comment on that?
Would I like to or will I?
Perhaps a minute or two?
I think what we've got now is a really sophisticated toolkit that's a bewildering array of possibilities. We've got people functioning at a level of what they've been comfortable with, generally working in a different field, but they don't really know what else is possible. So how do we build this kind of runway for people to take on? And we've got real experts and domain experts that really have great mental models of the way the world works. Our job is to get those models out of their head and into the computer so the computer can do what it's good at and free up the person with the abstract conceptualization skills to do that. So that's really just building this runway between the domain experts and the modeler, in fact making it easier to get that research out. The main problem is it's kind of a bit of a sort of black art. There's sort of as much art as there is science in the abstraction of the problem, capturing the essence, to simplify the problem. Reminds me of Blaise Pascal's line, but I didn't have time to write a short letter, so here's a long letter. So we often don't have time to build a simple model, so we build a complex model. But that takes time to abstract the essence. I don't know how much of it can be taught except by the close association and really a kind of an apprenticeship scheme. I guess the idea is how can we make that apprenticeship more accessible and online, and again, what sort of mentoring can be available. Really not relying on playing as much. So get the right mix of face-to-face and then ongoing collaboration in social media.
That's amazing, Jeff. Yeah, the ongoing community. Yeah. And maybe it's also worth interjecting there that it's important to note, as Jeff said, there's this bewildering toolkit of possibilities, right? Lots and lots of things. And the ability to use that toolkit is not necessarily the same as the ability to kind of carve out the right size problem. You can have an uber technical person who can put together the pieces in whatever way you want, but the question is, what way do you want it? And they won't necessarily have the impulse to kind of scope it in a safe way. And so there's learning that has to go on at these boot camps. There's kind of the simultaneous learning about sort of what makes a tractable, efficient, productive model on the one hand, as well as sort of what this toolkit is by which we make it. And both of those are tricky things, and it's the latter one, that ability to scope it effectively. Excuse me, I can't remember the order I mentioned, but it's the ability to scope it effectively, to carve out the right problem, and to sort of frame the problem well. That is the trickier one. That is the trickier one. And as Jeff said, apprenticeship seems to be the way of doing this. Apprenticeship and working alongside someone, right? It really comes down to the same thing as a colleague. Great. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Jeff. Very good. Any other questions, comments? Okay. So I need to